Now, African votes at the United Nations on the Russia-Ukraine war have revealed sharp divisions between countries. Djibouti, for example, has endorsed the UN resolution for Russia to end its offensive against Ukraine, while Algeria, Tanzania and South Africa remained neutral. Now, the question we ask is, can the continent remain neutral while the impact of the conflict in Europe has a bearing on us here in Africa directly? Well, to discuss this, we're joined by the Senior Research Fellow and Director at Africa-Asia Dialogue. That's Thembisa Fakude, who talks to us from Johannesburg. Mr. Fakude, thank you very much for your time. Let's begin with the heightened discussions. It's the only way that I can describe them. I watched yesterday the United Nations Security Council and indeed a representative from Ukraine speaking there, saying that no country can claim to be neutral in the face of the kind of war that is being unleashed on Ukrainians by Russia, because the impact of that war, as things stand right now, is affecting in particular those countries that are food deprived. And those can also be found here on the continent of Africa. So how does that message, how is it likely to land to countries such as South Africa, who claim that we have taken a deliberate stance of not taking sides and we are encouraging dialogue between these two countries?
Well, I think we can learn a lot from what Bishop Tutu said, that those who are neutral in terms of oppression or injustice are on the side of the oppressor. And I think we are forced at this point to take a position, because we all know that Russia was an aggressor in this instance. They went into Ukraine. Ukrainians did not go into Russia, but it was Russians who went to Ukraine to try and force them in terms of their choices when it comes to friends, because Ukraine has indicated that it wishes to strengthen relations with the European Union, and also it was looking at joining NATO. And Russia, of course, for reasons now that reasons unknown to most of us at the time, decided that they were going to go and invade Ukraine and stop them from doing so. So what we find ourselves at the moment in Africa is a continent that is fragmented because of the number of external players. We've got Russians, you've got Chinese, you've got Europeans, you've got Americans. All of these stakeholders are playing a role, and they've converted many of the African countries into client states. So it's unlikely, therefore, that you're going to have a unified position from an African position in terms of foreign policy. But at the same time, it's also unlikely that you're going to have a strong standalone foreign policy from individual countries when it comes to tackling countries such as Russia, bigger countries, including the Europeans, when it comes to their interests and when it comes to their own insistence on African countries to do as they suggest. So we find ourselves in a very complicated position, particularly South Africa, which claims to have a much more stronger foreign policy than the rest of African countries.
Well, as complicated a position that might be, Thembisa Fakude, do you think that African states, in particular those that are saying we're taking a neutral position, do you think they're likely to remain silent if and should Russia decide to use nuclear weapons against Ukraine?
Well, it's a good question. One will hope that they will want to be on the right side of history. We know now that the positions that were taken by those who decided to be neutral has impacted on the oil prices, has impacted on the food prices and general inflation around the world, because we did not take a much more firmer, direct position at condemning what Russia has done. And now here we are having to count the costs of this war. It has impacted on our energy crisis, it has impacted on food crisis, etc. So one hopes that countries such as South Africa, that has a little bit of a much more stronger voice, particularly within the African Union, they will take a much more stronger position, given what Vladimir Putin has said 2 days ago, that he has called on upon the reserves or the army reserves to come to the barracks and join the war, 300,000 of them. And he has also not written out the possibility of him using his nuclear arsenal in terms of pushing forward with his ambition of silencing the power of the Western countries and, of course, continue to dominate the politics of Ukraine and other countries in the region.
You single out South Africa, and I imagine it's deliberately so, given our standing on the global stage. South Africa, at some point, is going to really have to come to a decision. What in the world do we do when that time comes, given our fraternal relations with Russia? Remember, this is a country that, when we remember the days of oppression, we thank time and again for their assistance, because we are told by leaders of the day that some of our combatants here were trained in Russia.
Yes, that's true, but foreign policy is not cast in stone, nor is it blanket. You can still have relations with countries that you disagree with, and you can also cooperate on certain issues that are of mutual interest. And in this regard, South Africa has been known for standing firm for justice. South Africa has been known for speaking against those who seek to dominate global international foreign policy. And one would have hoped that this time around South Africa would have stood firm, particularly given that the reasons that were provided by Vladimir Putin as to why he decided to invade Ukraine did not make sense. One of them was that he was fighting anti-Semitism, notwithstanding that Volodymyr Zelensky, the president of Ukraine, is Jew himself. So you would have expected South Africa would have taken a much more sensible position in this regard. But instead, we decided to remain on the fence in this regard. And one hopes that as the nuclear rhetoric is amplified, particularly by the Russians, South Africa will change its position and take a much more firmer position that will ensure that this irresponsible behavior, which is likely, by the way, to kill all of us, notwithstanding that we're a bit too far away from action, but countries in proximity or within reach of those long-range missiles, which are carrying the nuclear weapons, are standing a chance of being obliterated by the irresponsible behavior of Vladimir Putin. So South Africa has got a responsibility. One, as the leader in Africa in terms of our own freedoms, but at the same time, our voice still counts because of the inheritance of Nelson Mandela and all those people that worked with him towards achieving a just world order.
I'm going to ask you in a moment about Africa and its continued call for it to have a permanent voice at the United Nations Security Council. But before that question, how close are we to this threat of nuclear weapons being deployed by Russia? Because there does seem to be an apprehension at the moment that that time is nearing, because just a few weeks ago, there were predictions that Russia is likely to pull out completely because of some of the territories that it had claimed in Ukraine, those having been taken back. And so the assumption was that Russia is not exactly winning this war. But now, as you've just said, there are suggestions that Russia is sending yet more troops, as in reservists, into that war. But at the same time, it does seem to be cornered somewhat, and there are threats. I listened to Medvedev. In fact, he wasn't speaking, but I think it was a tweet or a statement from him suggesting that any weaponry will be considered for Russia to defend itself. How close are we to that moment?
I think we're very close. And having listened to the president of Turkey, Tayyip Erdogan, who has said that we should, or the world should, look at a much more respectable way to get Putin out of this war, because it's humiliating for him. He was all show that he was going to go in and, shoot the Ukrainians into submission, but that hasn't happened. Instead, what we've seen the Ukrainians retaliating and recapturing all of those territories that were captured by the Russians since the 20th February when the war started. So Putin is in a much more difficult position. He's humiliated, and one wonders what he can do. And I think what Erdogan has said, he realizes that the man who's pushed into this corner has got the capability of doing whatever it takes, first to save his face, but at the same time, to come out of this fall as the winner, and it's not going to happen anytime soon. But importantly, we are likely to see him march into The Hague for crimes against humanity. So it's not going to be business as usual for him. So I think the world has to find an easier way, a respectable way of getting Putin out of this mess that he, by the way, landed himself. Nobody forced him, but he walked into it. So we hope that that's gonna happen anytime soon. But to answer your question directly, we can't write anything off. We have the North Koreans who time and again remind us that they've got nuclear weapons. We've got Pakistan and India that continues also to do the same. We've got Israel, who also has a number of nuclear arsenals that nobody knows about, and no one is even allowed to go and investigate on how much they have. So we have all of these bullies around the world who have these weapons of mass destruction. And if they were actually to execute, as Putin is threatening to do, we're all in trouble. And that is why South Africa has a responsibility to speak sense to its friend. Putin is part of BRICS and South Africa is part of BRICS. And one hopes that there is going to be some kind of constructive discussion on staying away from all of these destructive weapons that Putin is continually threatened to unleash.
Finally, and very briefly, you say that South Africa should talk to its friend. I remember at some point our president hosting one of the leaders, talking very strongly, I think it was his Mozambican counterpart, talking very strongly about the issue and the pressure that they ought to put at the United Nations for a continent as big as Africa to not have a permanent seat at the UN Security Council. Why has this eluded us for this long?
Well, I think we're not lobbying enough, and Africans are divided. If you remember, not long ago, Musa Faki Mohammed, who is the chairperson of the African Union Commission, decided to bring in Israel, for example, through the back door to have an observer mission within the AU, and that has created problems within the African Union. So you've got this fragmented African Union one who doesn't see the reason why they should go and lobby as a one voice in terms of having this position within the African Union Security Council. But at the same time, do we really want to be part of this African Union Security Council, a club of people who decide who lives and who dies? I'm not quite sure whether we want that, given that we have weaker borders, etc. I mean, countries like the current permanent 5 members who are part of this Security Council can protect their own borders. Whether Africa, and in this regard I think South Africa will play a huge role, want to be part of the club of who decides who lives and who dies. I'm not quite sure whether it would be a smart thing to do. Until we get our own business in order, I'm not quite sure whether we should rush into joining the United Nations Security Council.
Very interesting point there indeed. Thank you very much for your insights on this matter. Senior Research Fellow and Director at Africa-Asia Dialogue, Thembisa Fakude.